Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys about the press. A lot of people think of this as the strict standing overhead press, but historically this exercise was just called the press, and it's an exercise I've been doing a lot of. Again, if you guys recall earlier this year, I hit a 227.5 pound one rep max on this. And this is, again, an old school exercise that has fallen largely out of disuse, but we have seen a number of YouTubers promoting it again now, even some guys who I don't like that much promote it, and so I've got to give them credit for that. And it was popularized a lot in recent years, again, by Mark Ripito and the Starting Strength guys. And the press is historically considered to be one of the best mass and strength builders of all time. And for years and years and years, it was the go-to upper body pressing movement. And that had to do largely with the fact that we didn't have benches back then, so guys either floor press or they would clean the weight up and press it over their head. Now, again, it's an exercise that a lot of people consider to be unsafe, and that has to do largely with the bar path that people use. And usually when people are talking about overhead pressing being dangerous in terms of impingement, what they are talking about, it has to do with the way that you perform the exercise. Instead of, if you do it correctly and you lay back and then drive your head through and get the bar behind your head at the top, generally you can't impinge your shoulders doing it. But seated, it's far, far easier because of the way that people are seated, or people who do it in a Smith machine with the bar out way in front of them. That's how you impinge a shoulder while doing this exercise. But if you're able to kind of shrug a bit at the top and get it behind your head a bit, it's not going to happen. But the thing is, this exercise brings a lot to the table in terms of just overall strength and development, and even balancing out a lot of guys' aesthetics who chase a certain look. When you look at what muscles get worked on this, it tends to work for a lot of people are weak points and spots that a lot of people will go through a lot of trouble to try to isolate and work on. So again, brings a lot to the table there. But from a strength perspective, what we are dealing with is, again, a full body exercise. Even though it's working a lot of smaller muscles as the primary movers, things like your delts, your triceps, all of that, this exercise, you're doing standing on your feet, right? You're doing standing on your feet. So you have a lot of stabilizer involvement. You have a lot of core involvement. And because of the range of motion, it's probably just about the longest range of motion press that you're going to find, especially if you do it correctly and you start all the way on the chest. Like if you guys notice when I do it, for example, I take a deep breath between every rep and I start with it physically touching my chest and then drive it up. Well, if you look at the range of motion involved, that's a really long range of motion. And if you bring it all the way down like that, the additional chest work, the additional tricep work, everything else can be pretty pronounced. But as far as, again, strength building go, it's one of the few exercises in which you can do a pressing movement while driving through your legs, using your core, everything else. And for an athlete, that's a big deal. That really is a big deal, because if you want to be athletic, you have to learn to use a lot of these muscles in your body while using your entire body, while stabilizing your entire body, driving through your body. That's going to have better carryover to a lot of sports. And even the strict press, a lot of people say the push press. Well, the push press is great for a lot of contact sports and pushing sports, things like American football, rugby, MMA, boxing, things like that. But the strict press really in a lot of ways allows for a little more upper body development and a little more upper body strength, because you're having to start the weight from a dead stop on the chest, whereas in what's like the push press, your legs end up initiating a lot of the drive, and so you're maybe doing a little more work near the lockout, but there's a lot more lower body involvement, which it's a good exercise also. But the strict press has more potential for pure upper body development with a nice strength, full body strength component added to it. But when we start looking at what's going on here and you look at what the primary movers that everyone can see, it's very clear that obviously things like your anterior deltoid, your triceps, all of that get worked. But what we find on the standing press, because of, again, the bar path that's used, we get all that anterior delt, tricep, chest work, all of that we would get from even a seated press. But the way that we drive through at the top, when you start looking at EMG data, the lateral and posterior heads of the deltoid and the trapezius get worked a lot more. In fact, when you start looking at EMG data, you'll find that the upper traps get recruited on the standing press like this, more than on a lot of exercises that people think of as trap exercises. In other words, if you start looking at EMGs, it tends to beat things like the deadlift, it beats things like rack pulls, all of that stuff for just developing your upper traps. So again, for people who have that area that's lagging, this is a fantastic exercise to do. And if you start thinking of that in terms of strength carryover, again, it's a fantastic trap exercise. In fact, it builds your entire shoulder girdle. As far as any press goes, obviously the entire shoulder girdle does get worked more effectively on this than pretty much any other pressing movement that you can think of. So you get all those perks of a lot of other presses, again, upper chest, interior deltoids, everything else. But what's also interesting with this exercise is that it works the long head of the tricep. So if you look at when you're pressing it up over your head, you're going to find there's more involvement from the long head of the tricep, particularly if you do this longer range of motion. Well, that is a head of the tricep that gets largely neglected on most pressing exercises, like your bench press is a perfect example, your incline bench, a lot of those. So when you start looking at the muscles that get worked here, it works the entire shoulder girdle, works the triceps extremely effectively. Again, particularly depending on if you get that full bar path. If you start off the chest and get all the way with the bar behind your head a bit at the top, again, it's in a very, very long range of motion for the tricep. It's longer than a lot of presses is if you look at the entire movement involved. So again, for someone who's got lagging triceps who maybe doesn't want to add an isolation movement in, this can really, really help. And so for those guys who are chasing the whole aesthetics thing, look at what this exercise brings to the table. Look at what it brings to the table. Entire shoulder girdle development, right? It works all three heads of the delts. Now granted, that you still might need more work for the delts than this, but again, maybe balance it with enough pulling, pull-ups, rows, maybe face pulls. You really have complete shoulder girdle development there. Between those exercises, you just add one of those other ones in. So putting a lot of volume into this will tend to work all of that. So again, all three heads of the delts do get worked just to some extent. The traps get worked tremendously. All three heads of the triceps get worked on this exercise due to the range of motion involved and the movement pattern and the movement of the shoulder. So it can help bring up, again, all three heads of the tricep, including the long head, which tends to lag for a lot of people. If you do the full range of motion on the exercise, the upper chest gets worked. So when we look at what's getting hit here, what's being worked? The whole shoulder girdle, the upper chest, the long head of the tricep. For again, you guys who are chasing aesthetics, those are oftentimes major areas of concern. Those are major areas that lag. And when people start thinking of the classic physiques, you go back to the 50s and 60s, look at those classic physiques, and a lot of those guys had, especially considering they didn't have access to all the drugs that everyone have today, they tended to have very, very well-developed shoulder girdles. They tended to have very well-developed upper chests. Well, look at how much they focused on this exercise, right? Look how much they focus on this exercise. When you see all that, and then look at things like your abs, your core, everything else being utilized when you start doing any appreciable amount of weight on this, these are oftentimes show muscles. These are the muscles that a lot of people have that are lagging tremendously. This works them. It works them very, very hard. It can save people a lot of trouble in terms of developing weak points. In fact, if you look at this and then you look at something like a weighted chin-up or a weighted pull-up, that actually tends to balance out the muscles that, say, powerlifters, guys like me, you can focus on the squat, bench, deadlift. The muscles that don't get worked as much, particularly mainly the upper body muscles, obviously, that don't get worked as much, it might make powerlifters make us look less aesthetic by the standards of people who chase that. These would correct it. So I go so far as to say is that if you get really, really strong on the press, and I don't mean just your 1 rep max, I may do a lot of volume. Like I did 9 sets of it yesterday. You get really strong on the press and then weighted chin-ups, weighted pull-ups. For a lot of you guys out there, that alone is going to correct a lot of the imbalances in areas that you're probably going to spend hours and do half a dozen exercises trying to work on in your upper body, they'll get worked between those two exercises. It can bring up a lot of your potential weak points just by itself, in addition to being just an all-around badass exercise. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.